She took my hand without asking. That's the part I keep returning to, not the song, not the crowd partying around us like they'd rehearsed it, not the way the gymnasium lights turned everything the color of old photographs. Just that she reached across 10 years of silence and took my hand like she'd never put it down. Like the hand had always been hers, and she'd simply come back to collect it. Her name was Delia Marsh. And 3 weeks before that night, she had filed a formal complaint against me with our Alumni Association's ethics board. The kind of complaint that doesn't stay contained. The kind with documentation attached. The kind that had the potential to reach my state bar association and end a career I had spent a decade building one careful, correct decision at a time. Mostly correct. That was the problem. I almost didn't go to the reunion. My name is Marcus Hale, and I'm going to be straightforward with you about the reason I nearly stayed home. I spent most of high school trying very hard not to be noticed, and the idea of walking back into a gymnasium and watching people remember me, or worse, look through me like I was still the nervous kid who argued in paragraphs when normal people argued in sentences, felt like exactly the kind of punishment I'd spent a decade successfully avoiding. But my firm had sent a sponsorship check to the school's endowment fund. My managing partner, Gerald, who collected social obligations the way other people collect debt, had made it gently but unmistakably clear that my attendance was part of the arrangement. Gerald was 63 years old and had been practicing law for 35 of those years, and he had the particular gift of the truly powerful, which is that he never needed to make a threat explicit. His exact words were, "It would mean a great deal to the partners if a face from the firm was present." And his silences, the half-seconds between sentences where another person might have added warmth, were louder than most people's speeches. So, I went. I wore the gray jacket. I practiced my smile in the hotel bathroom mirror. I told myself I would stay for 2 hours, shake the right hands, make Gerald happy, and leave before anyone asked me what I'd been doing with my life in a way that required an honest answer. I had not, when I was making this plan, accounted for Delia Marsh. The first time I saw her that night, she was standing at the edge of the refreshment table with a glass of sparkling water, talking to no one, watching the room with the careful, cataloging attention of someone taking inventory. She looked exactly the same and completely different. Same dark eyes that moved like she was always 3 seconds ahead of the conversation. Same quality of stillness that she'd had in high school, where other people fidgeted and she just held. But something in the set of her jaw had changed, sharpened. The way a person sharpens when they've had to fight for things repeatedly, and eventually they stop being surprised by the fight. I recognized her before I consciously knew I was recognizing her. That's the only way I can describe it. Something in my chest registered her presence before my brain caught up with it, and supplied the name, and the context, and the cold spike of alertness that the context produced. Because I knew, with the particular clarity that arrives after 22 days of checking your inbox with your heart in your throat, exactly who Delia Marsh was. She was the person who had submitted a formal complaint to the Westfield Alumni Association Ethics Board, alleging that the endowment grant my firm had administered last fiscal year contained a structural conflict of interest. The complaint alleged, correctly, that I had, without disclosing it, directed a portion of the fund's discretionary allocation toward a non-profit organization where my former mentor served on the board. She wasn't wrong. That was the part that had been eating me alive. She was completely, precisely, professionally correct, and in 8 days, the board's ethics subcommittee was scheduled to meet, review her documentation, and make a recommendation. A recommendation that could, depending on what they found and how they framed it, be forwarded to the State Bar Association for professional conduct review. I thought about turning around and walking out the door I'd come in, Instead, I walked directly toward her. "Marcus Hale," she said, before I was close enough to be certain she'd seen me coming, like she'd had a compass pointing my direction all evening. "Delia Marsh." I stopped a reasonable distance from the refreshment table. "You look like someone who's been expecting this moment." "I've been expecting you to walk the other way." She took a sip of her water, unhurried. "You stood at the door for almost 4 minutes before you moved." "I was deciding something. I know." She set her glass down on the table with careful precision. "I was deciding whether to make it easier or harder. Which did you decide?" She looked at me then, directly, in the way I'd forgotten she used to look at people, like she was taking a measurement rather than a photograph. "I haven't yet." The DJ on the other side of the gym put on something from 2009. The kind of song that exists in the specific frequency of the person you were at 17. And around us, the reunion continued its business of being a reunion. People hugging and performing the light surprise of remembering each other. People checking their phones. People doing the math in real time on whether they were happy with how things had turned out. Delia and I stood at the edge of it. "The subcommittee meets in 8 days, I said. "I'm aware of when the subcommittee meets," she said. "I'm the one who filed the complaint." "Right." I looked at her. "I know what you're going to say. I doubt that. You're going to say it wasn't personal, that it was about the policy framework, that you would have filed the same complaint against anyone in my position." She considered this. "All of that is true," she said. "It's also not all of what I'm going to say." I waited. "I'm going to say," Delia said, "that I've known your name for 12 years, and I knew it was your name on that documentation the moment I saw it. And I filed the complaint anyway, because that's what the documentation required. And because you, specifically, would understand why." She picked up her glass again. "I'm not sure if that makes it more personal or less." I had no answer for that. I was still working out whether I'd just been complimented or indicted, or both. We circled each other for 40 minutes, not literally. We moved through the room, talked to other people, laughed at the appropriate moments in other people's reunion anecdotes. But underneath every conversation I had that night, there was an awareness of exactly where in the gymnasium Delia Marsh was standing, like a low-frequency signal I couldn't tune out. Twice I looked up to find her already looking at me, and both times she didn't look away first, which told me something I filed and didn't examine. At 9:15, the DJ did what DJs do at events like this. He put on a slow song. The particular slow song he chose was one I hadn't heard in years, and it was the specific kind of song that either clears a floor or fills it, depending on what year it is inside your memory. Around us, people moved, some toward the center, some toward the walls. Couples finding each other, singles staging tactical retreats toward the bar. The eternal choreography. Delia Marsh looked at me across 6 feet of reunion and said, "Dance with me." Not a question. Not an invitation with any trailing softness. A declarative sentence. "You're making a point," I said. "I am absolutely making a point." She extended her hand, palm up, and there was something in her face that I had been misreading all night. Not hostility, not triumph, not the cool satisfaction of someone holding leverage. Something else. Something that looked, if I was willing to be honest with myself for a moment, like exhaustion, like someone who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and had simply, quietly, decided to set it down on the dance floor of their high school gymnasium in front of 112 former classmates. "Dance with me anyway." I took her hand. Here is what I expected the dance to be. Strategic. 2 adversaries performing the physical vocabulary of connection while the real negotiation ran underneath, beneath the paper streamers and the cheap lights. Each of us scoring points in a game the audience couldn't see. I expected her to make a precise comment about the ethics complaint while we moved in slow circles. I expected to try to justify myself. I expected us to separate after 3 minutes exactly as far apart as we'd started. Here is what actually happened. She didn't say a word about the complaint. She said, "I used to watch you practice debate in the library. Through the little window in the door. You never looked up." I stared at her. "For how long?" "Most of junior year." A pause. "Senior year sometimes. Why are you telling me this right now?" "Because I have been professionally correct about you for 22 days, she said. "And I wanted to say one thing that isn't." We moved through half the song in silence after that. The gymnasium did its best impression of the past around us. The smell of the floors, the acoustic quality of 200 people in a room built for basketball, the decorations that had tried for elegant and landed at nostalgic. I was aware of her hand in mine, the particular way she moved, which was the same way she held still, deliberate, without waste. "I did it," I said. "What you alleged. I want you to know, I'm not going to stand here and tell you the documentation is wrong." "I know you're not," she said. "That's partly why I came tonight." "And the other part?" She didn't answer that immediately. When she did, she said, "You could have come to me when you saw my name on the complaint. You could have called, offered an explanation, asked me to withdraw it in exchange for a private correction." "I thought about it," I said. This was the truth. "I know." Her voice was level, "But you didn't do it. You've been sitting with it for 22 days and not trying to make it go away quietly. That tells me something." "What does it tell you?" "That you know what actually needs to change isn't just the paperwork." She met my eyes. "The policy framework is broken, Marcus. Not just your judgment call. The fund's governance structure allows this conflict to happen invisibly, and it will happen again with the next administrator if no one changes the structure. I filed the complaint because the complaint forces the structure into the light. Not because I wanted to punish you. I had no answer for that either." She was right again. She seemed to be structurally incapable of being wrong, which I was starting to find nearly unbearable, and also, underneath that, something else I wasn't ready to look at directly. The song ended. She let go of my hand and stepped back and said, 8 days, Marcus, not unkindly. Just accurate." Then she walked away, and I stood on the dance floor in the gray jacket, watching her go. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my hotel room and thought about what she'd said. The policy framework is broken. And I thought about what it means to do something wrong so gradually, so incrementally, so carefully dressed in the language of reasonable judgment, that you've stopped being able to see the shape of the thing you're actually doing. I'd told myself my mentor's organization was qualified, which it was. I'd told myself there was no direct personal benefit to me, which was technically true. I'd told myself that my judgment had simply aligned with the right outcome, which was the most persuasive thing I'd ever told myself, and also the most dishonest, because it evacuated the question of why my judgment had pointed that direction in the first place. I'd been speaking the language of technically true for so long that I had stopped hearing how it sounded. My phone lit up on the nightstand at 2:14 a.m. A text from a number I didn't have saved. The board meeting was moved. It's in 4 days, not 8. Someone on the subcommittee pushed for acceleration. I don't know who yet. I thought you should know. I stared at the ceiling for a while. Then I looked at the message again. 4 days. Half the time I thought I had. I typed, "Thank you." A pause. Long enough that I wondered if she'd put down her phone. Then, "Don't thank me. Fix it." I saved the contact under her name and lay in the dark, thinking about what fixing it would actually require. Not the surface fix. Not the apology letter and the quiet correction. The real fix. The one that changed the structure. The one that Delia had been describing on the dance floor. The one that meant walking into a room and saying the thing I'd been talking around in technically true language for nearly a month. By 4 a.m. I had a rough plan. By 5:30 I was in the shower. By 8:45 I was on the highway back toward the city. Gerald was in his usual position behind his desk when I arrived, hands folded on the surface, face in its standard configuration of implication, the ability to convey complete sentences through the arrangement of silence. He was the most efficient communicator I had ever worked with, which meant he was also the most economical with comfort, because comfort costs syllables and Gerald did not spend them lightly. "You look like you drove through the night," he said. "I drove through the morning," I said. "There's a difference." Marginally, he unfolded his hands and folded them again, differently, which was Gerald's version of inviting me to sit down. The board meeting moved. "I know. I want to talk to you about the endowment. I suspected you might." I sat down. I told him everything. Not the version where my judgment calls were reasonable and the conflict of interest was technical and the outcome was defensible. The actual version. The one that started with my mentor calling me in March and asking whether the discretionary allocation had been finalized. The one where I had known, in the moment he asked, what he was really asking, and had told myself that directing funds toward a qualified organization wasn't the same thing as a favor. And had believed myself, because I'd needed to. Gerald listened the way Gerald always listened, which was completely still. Not the stillness of someone waiting for you to finish, but the stillness of someone processing very fast. When I stopped talking, he said, "What do you want to happen?" "I want to go to the subcommittee voluntarily. Before the meeting. Disclose everything. The March emails, the decision process, the connection I should have flagged, and I want to propose a governance revision. A structural change to the fund's oversight framework that prevents this conflict from being possible for the next administrator." Gerald was quiet. "I want to be the person who brings the fix," I said, "not just the person who caused the problem." He looked at me for 3 full seconds, which was a long time for Gerald. "That is," he said finally, "either the thing that saves your career or the thing that ends it. I am genuinely uncertain which. Both outcomes are plausible from where I'm sitting." "So am I," I said. "But it's the right thing to do." Another silence. Gerald at his most Gerald. "All right," he said. "Let's build the documentation." We worked through that afternoon and into the evening. His assistant brought sandwiches at 7 p.m. that neither of us fully ate. We pulled the grant records, the meeting minutes, the full March email chain where my mentor had first raised the allocation question, the fund's governance documents, the board's approval vote. We built a disclosure timeline that concealed nothing, annotated with context that explained the reasoning at each step without excusing it. We drafted a disclosure letter that was precise about what had happened, honest about what I should have done differently, and specific about the governance revision I was proposing. At 10:47 p.m., my phone buzzed. "Delia, how's it going?" Me, building the disclosure package. A pause. "Delia, we?" "Me, my managing partner. He's helping." Another pause. Longer. "Delia, I didn't expect that." Me. "Neither did I. Honestly. Delia, what changed?" I looked at the question for a while before answering. What had changed was that I'd been on a gymnasium dance floor with someone who had paid careful attention to me for longer than I'd known, and had looked at me clearly, not forgivingly, not harshly, just clearly. And it had made the technically true language I'd been living in for 3 weeks feel like what it actually was. A wall I'd built because I didn't want to see what was on the other side of it. I typed, "Someone said the right thing at the right moment." Her response came after a minute, "There's something else you need to know. The board chair already received a call tonight about the endowment. I don't know who from. Someone reached out to him after the meeting was accelerated." I sat back from the laptop. Someone had called the board chair tonight, separately from Delia's complaint, after the timeline had been compressed. The complaint had been Delia's, documented, principled, based on a framework she'd been building in her professional mind for years. But the acceleration, apparently, was someone else's work. And someone calling the board chair at night, in advance of a subcommittee meeting, was not the act of someone motivated by policy reform. That was the act of someone who wanted a specific outcome. I called Priya at 7 the next morning, sitting in my car in the parking structure before the building had filled up. Priya had been practicing ethics and professional conduct law for 18 years, and was one of the 3 people I had called first when Delia's complaint arrived. She had the particular gift of understatement that some lawyers develop when they've delivered enough bad news. She never softened things, but she never dramatized them either, which meant that when the news was bad, the lack of drama itself told you something. "Tell me about the acceleration," I said. "Before we get there," she said, "I need to ask you something. Who else had access to the March email chain? The correspondence between you and your mentor?" I thought about it. Gerald, my assistant at the time, peripherally, my mentor. And one other person, a junior associate named Corey, who had been part of the endowment team during the grant cycle, and who had left the firm 8 months ago to go to a competitor. Left unhappy, in the specific way that unhappy departures tend to produce, the carefully professional exit interview, the too careful forwarding of files. The absence of a goodbye lunch. I said Corey's name. Priya was quiet for exactly 2 beats. "He filed a bar complaint 3 days ago," she said. "Separate from the alumni board process. Directly with the professional conduct division." The parking structure was very quiet around me. The subcommittee chair received a call flagging the incoming bar complaint. Priya continued. "Whoever called suggested the board should move quickly so their process wasn't seen as reactive to the bar inquiry. That's why the timeline compressed. A formal bar complaint, not an alumni board review, not an institutional ethics discussion, but a professional conduct inquiry with the state bar, was a different category of thing entirely. If it progressed to a formal investigation, the outcomes ranged from reprimand to suspension to disbarment. It didn't matter that the underlying facts were the same as Delia's complaint. The instrument was different. The stakes were different. Corey had waited 8 months. He had filed 3 days after Delia's complaint became known to the board, which meant he'd heard about it, watched it land, and decided the timing was ideal to add his own weight to the scale. "How long do I have?" I said. "To submit the voluntary disclosure before the bar formally opens an inquiry." "The preliminary review process usually takes," Priya paused. "I think you have 48 hours, possibly less if Corey is talking to anyone on the conduct board directly." I called Delia from the car before I went upstairs. She picked up on the second ring. "Corey Amst filed a bar complaint," I said. "Silence. I need to ask you directly," I said. "Did you know he was going to do this?" "No." Her voice was clear and immediate. "Marcus, my complaint is mine. I built it. I filed it. I can account for every piece of documentation in it. I did not coordinate with Corey. I don't even know him except as a name in alumni communications." "I know," I said. And I did know. The two complaints fit together the way opportunism fits onto principle. Corey using Delia's work as a platform for his own grievance, not as a collaboration. She had done something honest and structural. He had done something tactical and personal. They were not the same thing, even if they were aimed at the same set of facts. "I'm going to submit the voluntary disclosure today," I said, "before the bar formally opens the inquiry. Priya thinks I have 48 hours. That's the right call." "I know. And Delia, I stopped. I want you there. When I submit it, as the original complainant, I think the board needs to see the person who filed the complaint standing alongside the person making the disclosure. It changes what this looks like. Not two separate processes colliding, but one honest conversation about what went wrong and how to fix it." A long silence. "You want me to provide cover," she said. "Not accusatory. Just precise." "No. I want the subcommittee to understand that you filed because you wanted the policy to change, not because you wanted me destroyed. And I want them to understand that I'm disclosing because I agree with you. Those are two different things from what Corey is doing." "They are," she said quietly. "I know they are. So, will you come?" The pause this time was the kind that means someone is doing the real deciding, the kind that isn't about the answer itself, but about what the answer means for what comes after. "What time?" she said. We submitted the voluntary disclosure at 2 p.m. Delia sat to my left. Gerald sat to my right. 4 subcommittee members across the table, each of them in the careful, measured posture of people trying to determine in real time whether what they were seeing was genuine or a performance of genuine. I spoke for 11 minutes. I did not use technically true language. I described what happened, what I had understood about what was happening at the time, where the understanding I'd had at the time had been convenient rather than honest, and what I was proposing to change, not just for myself, but in the fund's governance framework. When Delia spoke, she said 4 things. She said the complaint had been about the policy, not the person. She said the voluntary disclosure was consistent with the intent behind the complaint. She said she supported the governance revision. She said she was prepared to contribute to its development. There was a silence when she finished. The subcommittee chair said, "Miss Marsh, you filed the original complaint." "Yes, and you're here, with Mr. Hale. Together, I'm here with my own statement," she said, "which independently supports the same outcome Mr. Hale is seeking." That's not a contradiction. That's just what it looks like when 2 people want the same thing for different reasons and are willing to say so in the same room at the same time. The chair looked at her for a moment. A real look. The kind that's doing work. Then, barely, a nod. The subcommittee's preliminary recommendation arrived 5 days later. No referral to the Bar Association, pending the completion of the proposed governance revision, subject to a formal review in 90 days. Corey's bar complaint was noted as substantially addressed by the voluntary disclosure. The preliminary bar inquiry closed without opening a formal investigation. Gerald delivered the news in his office in Gerald's way, procedural language. No warmth, complete confidence that I would locate the relief myself, without him directing me to it. When I thanked him, he said, "Don't thank me. You built the documentation." And then, after a pause that was very nearly a full second longer than Gerald's usual pauses, that took some courage. Coming from Gerald, that was practically a standing ovation. I texted Delia when I got the news. Preliminary recommendation. No referral. 90-day review. 6 minutes later, I know. The chair's office called me. Me, how do you feel? A longer pause. Delia, like someone who spent years building a case in her head and weeks building it on paper and now has to figure out what she does with all that attention. Me, what does that mean? Delia, it means I've been watching you since we were 17, Marcus, and I am very tired of doing it from a distance. I sat with that for a long time. The afternoon light moved across my desk. Somewhere down the hall someone laughed at something, and the laugh faded, and the office came back to its regular frequency of keyboards and distant phones and the particular quiet of a Wednesday afternoon. I typed, then stop. A pause. Delia. That is not a plan. Me. It's a start. We had dinner 3 days later. The restaurant was neither of our first choices, which meant we'd negotiated the location via text in a way that told me more about both of us than either of us acknowledged. She didn't want somewhere loud. I didn't want somewhere with the specific energy of a performance. And we landed on a corner table at a place with good lighting and no ambient music that turned out to be exactly right. Over the course of 3 hours, she told me about the 4 years she'd spent at a legal policy nonprofit after law school. The particular way that watching a governance framework fail repeatedly either makes you give up or makes you very precise about what needs to change. She told me about the moment she'd recognized my name on the endowment documentation. She'd been looking at that kind of documentation for 6 years, and my mentor's organization had appeared twice before in adjacent contexts, never as a recipient, always nearby, always at the edge of the frame. It wasn't personal, she said, until the moment I saw your name, and it was. What made it personal? She turned her wine glass by the stem. Once, I'd been practicing the conversation for 3 weeks before I filed. Every version of it ended in the same place, you standing at a refreshment table, trying to decide whether to walk toward me or away. I could see it that clearly. She paused. The conversation never got further than that in my head. I had no idea what happened after. And now you do. Now I do. She looked at me with that measuring quality that I had been misreading all my life as distance and was only now starting to understand as the opposite. Attention so careful, it can't afford to be casual. I want to tell you something that I've been holding for a long time. You don't have to do anything with it. Tell me, I watched you practice debate for most of junior year because I thought you were the most honest person I'd ever seen argue. You were the only person in that room who argued like it mattered whether you were right, not just whether you won. I thought about introducing myself for months, and I never did because I didn't know what introducing myself would make me. A pause. Invested, I think. It would have made me invested. And I was very careful about what I got invested in. What changed? I saw your name on a document where it shouldn't have been, she said simply. And I realized I was more disappointed than surprised, which told me I'd been paying attention to you for 12 years, which meant I was already invested. So I stopped pretending otherwise. I looked at her across the table, the careful jaw, the eyes that were always 3 seconds ahead, the quality of stillness that had been there at 17 and was still there now, sharpened by everything that had happened in the intervening years. The complaint was an introduction, I said. The complaint was a complaint, she said. The 2am text was an introduction. The governance revision took 11 weeks. Delia joined the working group, which meant every Tuesday for 3 months we were in the same calls. She with her policy background, me with the fund's documentation. Both of us developing opinions about the other's work that were strong, specific, and occasionally inconvenient for the 6 other people in the room. She had a gift for catching the line in a draft that read clearly and meant nothing, the clause that looked like accountability and performed like a decorative element. I had a gift for holding a structural position under extended pressure until someone gave me a real reason to move it, which she sometimes interpreted as stubbornness and sometimes as integrity, and was usually right about which. My colleague Ren said, after the fourth Tuesday session, "Are you two? We're working on the revision together," I said. "I know what you're working on," Ren said. "It's still a question." What we were at that point was two people who had a standing dinner every Friday, who had spent a Saturday walking a trail Delia knew, and I didn't, talking for 4 hours about everything other than the working group, who understood, without having discussed it, that there was a shape to what was between us that we were moving through, and that there were no shortcuts through the shape, only the shape itself. She kissed me first. We were in my office on a Wednesday evening, reviewing the final revision language. Take-out containers between us, her annotated copy beside my laptop. She caught a line that read ambiguously, and I agreed she was right, and she said I'm usually right, lightly, without any of the weight she'd been carrying for 12 years, just easy and accurate, and hers. And something about that ease made me look at her a moment too long. She kissed me. Then she picked up her pen and pointed at the ambiguous clause. "Now can we fix this?" she said. We fixed it. The 90-day review came back clean. The board formally adopted the governance revision. Gerald said the partners are pleased, which, as previously noted, was effusive. Delia texted me a photograph of the final approved text with a single word. "Done," I called her. "Done," I said. "Done," she confirmed. "The framework is better. The next person who sits where you sat, the conflict will be visible before it happens, not after." A pause. "Marcus, can I say something that isn't professionally correct? I would genuinely love that. I am really, truly glad you didn't turn around and leave when you saw me at that gymnasium." I thought about the 4 minutes at the door, the practiced smile, the 2 hours I'd planned to stay. "I almost did," I said. "I know," she said. "I was watching." Of course she was. She'd been watching for 12 years, through a library door window, and across reunion gymnasiums, and across 900 miles of documentation. And it had taken me a decade, an ethics complaint, a 2am text, a dance in a gymnasium, 48 hours of sleepless work, and 11 weeks of Tuesday calls to understand what it means to be watched that carefully, not to be judged, not to be managed, not to be handled, but to be seen. To have someone pay the kind of attention that tracks the difference between what you do and what you actually are, and stay anyway, and tell you. I hadn't been looking for that. I hadn't known I needed it. I'd been so busy being careful, being technically correct, building the version of Marcus Hale that could walk into any room and hold the weight of it, that I'd stopped noticing what it was costing me to carry it alone. Delia had noticed. She'd been noticing for years, and she'd filed a formal ethics complaint and texted me at 2am and stood in a subcommittee hearing and joined an 11-week working group because she was, in the specific and irreducible way that makes a person real, invested. She'd told me that herself. The only thing I hadn't done was let it reach me. The last thing I want to tell you is not about the bar complaint, or the subcommittee, or the governance revision that's now in its 2nd year of implementation. It's about a Tuesday morning in the winter after all of this, sitting at my desk before the office had filled, thinking about what Delia had said on the dance floor. I wanted to say one true thing that isn't professionally correct. That's what she'd offered. Not a deal, not a negotiation, not a strategic softening of her position. A true thing offered before the outcome was settled, before she knew whether I would earn it. She'd said something real before she had any reason to believe I would say something real back. And I had. I did it. I know that. Not a defense. Not an explanation, just the actual true thing, spoken on a dance floor in a gymnasium that smelled like the past. What happened after wasn't legal procedure or institutional reform, though those things happened. What happened after was two people who had been circling each other since they were 17, deciding that the distance had become more expensive than the risk of closing it. The policy is better now. That matters. It's the part of this story that actually changed something beyond the two of us. But it's not what I come back to. What I come back to is her hand in mine. The paper streamers. The cheap lights that turned everything gold. The feeling of being seen, not the version of yourself you've constructed and maintained and defended, but the actual you, mid-mistake, mid-correction, in the middle of everything complicated, and being told, without fanfare, that that version was the one worth paying attention to. That's what she gave me. Not absolution. Attention. There is a difference. And it is the whole difference. Have you ever looked back and realized that the person who saw your worst moment most clearly was the same one who believed in what you could do with what came after? And have you ever let someone's real attention, the kind that's been quietly tracking you for longer than you knew, finally reach you, instead of deflecting it off the surface of whoever you decided to become? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.